Sophia's hands trembled as Vincent Wallace's cold smile cut through the ballroom's warmth, his voice carrying across crystal and champagne. Surely our waitress can entertain us with something classical. The laughter that followed felt like shards of glass, but as her fingers found the piano keys, none of them knew they were about to witness something that would haunt and heal them forever. The Palmer House Hotel's grand ballroom gleamed like a jewel box under the soft glow of 6 crystal chandeliers, each one casting dancing light across marble floors that had witnessed a century of Chicago's most exclusive gatherings. The air thrummed with the low murmur of conversation, the delicate clink of Waterford crystal, and the rustle of designer gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Sophia moved through this world like a ghost, her black non-slip shoes silent against the polished marble as she balanced silver trays laden with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres that guests consumed without thought. Her white button-down shirt was pressed to perfection, her black apron tied with military precision, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck. At 24, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that survival meant being simultaneously invisible and indispensable. Before we continue this wonderful story, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now let's get back to the story. She paused at table 7, refilling water glasses for a group of women whose jewelry could fund her mother's treatments for a year. Their conversation washed over her, complaints about vacation homes in the Hamptons, debates over which private school offered the best connections, laughter that never quite reached their eyes. Sophia had learned to tune it out, to focus instead on the mental calculations that governed her existence. Rent due in 6 days, Mum's medication costs climbing, the electric bill that would push her checking account into dangerous territory. "Excuse me," one of the women said, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for service staff. "This champagne is warm." "Of course, ma'am. I'll bring you a fresh glass immediately." Sophia's smile was professional, practiced, revealing nothing of the exhaustion that lived in her bones from working the breakfast shift at Lou Mitchell's diner, the afternoon shift at the hotel, and the weekend catering gigs that barely kept her family afloat. As she moved toward the kitchen, her eyes caught on the magnificent Steinway grand piano positioned near the ballroom's tall windows. The instrument sat silent and untouched, its ebony surface reflecting the chandelier light like black water. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory awakening after months of forced dormancy. She could almost feel the cool smoothness of the keys, hear the rich resonance that had once been as natural to her as breathing. 3 years ago she'd been Sophia Martinez, scholarship student at the Chicago Conservatory of Music, her days filled with Chopin etudes and Rachmaninoff concertos. Professor Williams had called her a once-in-a-generation talent, and she'd believed him. The acceptance letter to Juilliard still sat in her childhood bedroom, yellowed now with unfulfilled dreams. But cancer didn't care about talent or potential. When her mother's diagnosis arrived with bills that insurance wouldn't cover, Sophia had made the only choice love allowed. She'd traded concert halls for dining rooms, Steinway for serving trays, applause for the kind of invisibility that paid the bill. Across the ballroom, Vincent Wallace stood at the head table, commanding attention without effort. At 60, he possessed the kind of distinguished presence that came from decades of being the most important person in any room. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo tailored to hide the slight softening around his middle, his posture erect with the confidence of a man who'd never known real failure. He surveyed the gathering with satisfaction. Chicago's elite had turned out in force for his annual Children's Cancer Charity Gala, their checkbooks as open as their need to be seen doing good. The irony wasn't lost on him that most of these people cared more about the tax write-offs than the cause. But Vincent had long ago learned to use people's vanity for genuinely useful purposes. His wife Margaret would have loved this, the elegant setting, the carefully orchestrated social dynamics, the way money and compassion could dance together when properly choreographed. But Margaret had been gone for 2 years now, and Vincent attended these events alone, surrounded by hundreds of people who knew his name, but not his heart. He caught sight of his reflection in the ballroom's mirrored wall, a successful man in an expensive tuxedo, philanthropist and business leader, widower who'd channeled grief into charitable giving. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, he wondered if anyone would miss him if he were gone, or if they'd simply find another wealthy patron to court and flatter. Vincent! The voice belonged to Harrison Reed, a contemporary from the country club whose enthusiasm for good causes lasted exactly as long as the social season. Magnificent turnout tonight. Margaret would be so proud. Thank you, Harrison. Vincent's smile was warm but practiced. She always said the best way to honor grief was to transform it into something useful. As they talked, Vincent's attention drifted to the silent piano. Margaret had been a pianist, not professionally, but with enough skill to fill their Lincoln Park mansion with music during their 30-year marriage. Some of his warmest memories were of finding her at their own Steinway, playing Debussy nocturnes, while dinner simmered in the kitchen. You know, Harrison continued, it's a shame that piano isn't being used. Seems like such a waste at a gathering like this. Vincent nodded absently, his gaze following a young waitress as she moved with unusual grace between tables. Something about her bearing caught his attention, the way she held her shoulders, the careful precision of her movements, the subtle way she seemed to listen to conversations without appearing to eavesdrop. Most service staff blended into background noise, but this one had a presence that whispered of stories untold. Perhaps we should remedy that, Vincent said suddenly, an idea forming that he'd later wish he could take back. A little impromptu entertainment might add some charm to the evening. He excused himself from Harrison and made his way across the ballroom, his steps purposeful as the idea took shape. The guests were between courses, conversation flowing freely with the wine, the perfect moment for something unexpected. Vincent prided himself on reading people, on understanding what motivated them, what made them useful. But as he approached the young waitress refilling glasses at a corner table, he had no idea he was about to encounter someone whose depths would challenge everything. He thought he knew about talent, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. Sophia sensed his approach before she saw him, the subtle shift in the room's energy that happens when someone powerful moves with purpose. She straightened, professional smile in place, prepared for whatever request or complaint might be coming. "Excuse me," Vincent said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Vincent Wallace, your host this evening." "Good evening, Mr. Wallace. I'm Sophia. Is there something I can help you with?" Vincent studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she met his gaze directly despite the obvious disparity in their social positions. "Actually, yes. I couldn't help but notice that beautiful piano sitting unused, and I thought perhaps, well, surely someone with your poise might have some musical ability." The question hung in the air between them, innocent on the surface but weighted with assumptions that made Sophia's chest tighten. She recognized the tone, the same one used by people who expected her to be grateful for any attention, who saw her as a potential source of amusement rather than a person with her own story. Have you ever been in a moment where someone's casual cruelty was about to change your life forever? Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need our gifts the most. "I'm working this evening, sir," Sophia replied carefully, her professional mask firmly in place. "But I'm sure one of your guests might be willing to perform." Vincent's smile widened, but something in it felt predatory now, like he'd sensed weakness and decided to pursue it. "Nonsense. I'm sure our guests would love some authentic entertainment. Consider it part of the evening's program." The words seemed to echo across the ballroom, drawing attention from nearby tables. Sophia felt the weight of a dozen gazes settling on her, measuring, judging, waiting to see how this scene would unfold. And in that moment she realized Vincent Wallace had just turned her into his evening's entertainment, willing or not. The ballroom fell into that particular kind of silence that happens when society's elite sense drama unfolding. Conversations halted mid-sentence, champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, and all eyes turned toward the corner where Vincent Wallace stood beside the young waitress, his smile sharp as crystal. Sophia felt the weight of 200 gazes pressing against her skin like physical touch. The murmur of voices had died to a whisper, replaced by the electric anticipation of spectators who'd stumbled upon unexpected entertainment. Her fingers tightened around the water pitcher she'd been holding, knuckles white against the silver handle. "Come now," Vincent continued, his voice carrying easily across the marble floors. "Surely you're not shy. I'm sure our guests would appreciate a little music with their evening." The invitation wasn't really an invitation. Sophia recognized the steel beneath the silk. She'd encountered this before, the particular cruelty of people who wielded kindness like a weapon, who offered opportunities that were really humiliations dressed in formal wear. "Mr. Wallace," she said quietly, hoping to lower the volume of this exchange, "I'm really not—" "Please," Vincent interrupted, his tone taking on the false warmth of someone playing to an audience. "I insist. Consider it a special request from the host." Harrison Reed materialized beside Vincent, sensing entertainment. What a marvelous idea, nothing like some authentic music to complement the evening. "Authentic," another voice chimed in from a nearby table. "How refreshing." The word hung in the air, laden with assumptions and prejudices that made Sophia's skin crawl. She understood now what was happening. She was being asked to perform like a trained animal, to provide authentic entertainment for people who saw her as fundamentally different from themselves. But beneath their expectant faces, she caught sight of the piano. The Steinway sat bathed in golden light from the chandeliers, its polished surface reflecting the room's opulence back at itself. For just a moment, she could hear it calling to her, not the voices of the crowd, but the instrument itself, patient and waiting. "I appreciate the suggestion," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "But I'm not a performer. I'm here to work." Vincent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the mask of benevolence slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. "Oh, come now. Don't be modest. I'm sure you have some natural rhythm." The phrase landed like a slap. Around them, the crowd stirred with uncomfortable energy, some guests shifting in their seats at the obvious implications, others leaning forward with the hunger of people who enjoyed watching others squirm. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from anger. Pure, clean anger at being reduced to a stereotype, at having her dignity questioned by a man who knew nothing about her except the color of her skin and the uniform she wore. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice gaining an edge that cut through the ballroom's hushed atmosphere, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all," Vincent replied, his smile never wavering. "I'm simply asking our staff to help make the evening special. Surely that's not too much to ask." The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing the tension crackling between them. Some guests looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding, while others watched with the fascination of people observing a social experiment. Sophia realized she was trapped, refuse, and risk her job and the income her family desperately needed. Comply and become the evening's entertainment for people who would never see her as more than a curiosity. But then her eyes found the piano again, and something inside her shifted. The Steinway wasn't just an instrument, it was a voice. Her voice. And maybe, just maybe, it was time these people heard what that voice could say. "All right," she said quietly, setting down the water pitcher with deliberate care. "I'll play." The murmur of approval rippled through the crowd as guests settled back in their chairs, ready for the show. Vincent's smile broadened with triumph, and he gestured grandly toward the piano like a ringmaster presenting his main attraction. Sophia walked across the marble floor, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Each step felt monumental, carrying her from one life toward another, from invisibility toward a moment that would define everything that came after. The piano bench was exactly the right height, adjustable like the ones at the conservatory. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys, feeling the familiar coolness of ivory and ebony beneath her fingertips. The muscle memory was instant and overwhelming. 3 years of absence dissolving in a heartbeat, as her body remembered what it meant to be whole. Behind her, she could hear Vincent's voice as he played host to his captive audience. "Let's see what our young performer can manage. Perhaps something simple, a spiritual maybe." The suggestion was meant to diminish her, to box her into the narrow space his prejudices had carved out, but Sophia smiled as her fingers found their positions on the keys. If Vincent Wallace wanted authentic, she would give him authentic, just not the version he expected. She began with a single note, middle C, played softly, letting it resonate through the ballroom's perfect acoustics. Then another note joined it, and another, building slowly into something the audience didn't recognize but felt in their bones. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece she'd been practicing when her mother's diagnosis changed everything. But she wasn't playing it as written. She was interpreting it, making it hers, weaving into the classical structure all the pain and beauty and struggle of the last 3 years. The first movement began like a prayer, each note crystalline and precise, building toward the thunderous crescendo that had once made her professor weep. But Sophia had learned things about music that conservatory couldn't teach. She'd learned how heartbreak could deepen harmony, how sacrifice could sharpen melody, how love could transform even the most technically perfect performance into something transcendent. The ballroom had gone absolutely still. This wasn't the simple, authentic entertainment they'd expected. This was something else entirely, something that demanded respect rather than merely observed tolerance. Vincent's smile had frozen on his face as the first movement built toward its climactic peak. He'd expected competence at best. Perhaps a few familiar melodies played adequately enough to amuse his guests. What he was hearing instead was artistry of a caliber that belonged on the world's greatest stages. As Sophia moved into the second movement, the music became a conversation between her past and present, the dreams she'd surrendered, and the strength she'd gained in the surrendering. Her technique was flawless, but technique was just the foundation. What she was building on top of it was something that came from lived experience, from understanding that music wasn't just about perfect execution, but about truth told through sound. The guests sat transfixed, champagne forgotten, conversations abandoned. Some recognized the piece and were stunned by the interpretation. Others simply felt the emotional weight of what they were witnessing, a young woman transforming humiliation into triumph, using her tormentor's weapon against him with devastating precision. But the most profound transformation was happening inside Vincent Wallace himself. As the music washed over him, he felt something crack open in his chest, a recognition that he'd encountered something sacred and had nearly missed it entirely. This wasn't the simple performance he'd demanded. This was genius, pure and undeniable, and he'd almost destroyed it with his casual cruelty. When Sophia finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, no one dared to break the spell she'd woven through sheer force of talent and will. Then, slowly, Vincent began to clap. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, and suddenly everyone was applauding. Not the polite, measured applause of social obligation, but the thunderous, sustained ovation reserved for greatness. Sophia rose from the piano bench and turned to face the room, her expression calm and dignified. She'd given them exactly what Vincent had asked for, authentic entertainment. But she'd done it on her own terms, with her own voice, and in doing so had revealed the poverty of his assumptions and the wealth of her spirit. As the applause continued, Vincent felt the full weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders like lead. He'd tried to humiliate someone whose little finger possessed more artistry than he had in his entire body. And worst of all, he'd done it in front of 200 witnesses who now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The question hanging in the chandelier-lit air was no longer what Vincent Wallace could do to Sophia Martinez. It was what Sophia Martinez had just done to Vincent Wallace, and whether either of them would ever be the same. The applause seemed to last forever, and no time at all. When it finally died away, the ballroom settled into an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than the chandeliers hanging overhead. Sophia stood beside the piano, her hands clasped in front of her, watching as 200 of Chicago's elite tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Vincent Wallace remained frozen near table 7, his face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the earthquake happening beneath. Around him, guests whispered urgently among themselves, some expressing genuine awe at the performance, others clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly their host had been upstaged by a waitress. "My God," breathed Mrs. Catherine Phillips from the museum board, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "That was extraordinary. Where on earth did she study?" "Juilliard, perhaps," suggested her companion. "That kind of technique doesn't come from nowhere." Sophia felt their speculative gazes like spotlights, dissecting her performance for clues about her background, her training, her right to possess such talent. She'd expected this. The discomfort people felt when their assumptions crumbled, the need to categorize and explain what couldn't be easily dismissed. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "If you'll excuse me, I should return to my duties." She moved to step away from the piano, but Vincent's voice stopped her. "Wait." The word came out rougher than he'd intended, betraying emotions he wasn't ready to examine. "That was exceptional, truly." Sophia turned to face him, and for the first time that evening she saw something vulnerable in his expression. The commanding presence had cracked, revealing glimpses of genuine shock and what might have been shame. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the kitchen will be wondering where I've gone." But Harrison Reed stepped forward, his face flushed with wine and excitement. "Nonsense! You can't just walk away after that, Vincent. Surely we need to know more about our talented young performer." Vincent winced at the word performer, finally understanding how it must have sounded to Sophia. "Harrison, perhaps we should—" "Are you classically trained?" Harrison continued, oblivious to the tension crackling between Vincent and Sophia. "That was Rachmaninoff, wasn't it? The second concerto?" "Yes," Sophia replied quietly. "It was." "Magnificent. And where did you study?" "Conservatory. Private instruction?" The questions came rapid-fire, well-meaning but invasive, treating her like an exotic specimen to be examined rather than a person to be respected. Sophia felt the familiar weight of being different, of having her achievements questioned and dissected because they didn't fit the narrow boxes people had built in their minds. "I studied at the Chicago Conservatory," she said, watching as several guests exchanged surprised glances. "On scholarship." "Studied?" Mrs. Phillips leaned forward, her pearls catching the chandelier light. "Past tense. Surely someone with your talent is still pursuing music professionally." The question hung in the air like a blade. Sophia felt the weight of her choices, her sacrifices, the dreams she'd folded away like expensive clothes she could no longer afford to wear. Around her, the wealthy elite waited for an explanation that would make sense of why someone who could play like that was serving their champagne. "Life had other plans," she said simply, and something in her tone warned against further questions. But Harrison, emboldened by alcohol and audience, pushed forward. "Come now, there must be more to the story. Talent like that doesn't just disappear into service work." "What happened?" The words hit like a physical blow. Sophia felt her carefully constructed composure wavering, the professional smile threatening to crack under the weight of 3 years' worth of buried grief and frustration. Vincent saw it happening and felt something twist in his chest, a recognition that his casual cruelty had set this entire scene in motion, had turned a private person's pain into public entertainment. "Harrison, I think we should—" "No, it's all right," Sophia interrupted, her voice gaining strength from some deep well of resolve. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you." She turned to face the room, her posture straight and proud, despite the tremor in her voice. 3 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. The treatments that insurance wouldn't cover cost more than a conservatory student could earn in a lifetime. So I made a choice: continue pursuing my dreams while my mother died, or set them aside to save her life. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Where before it had been expectant, hungry for entertainment, now it was heavy with recognition of real pain, real sacrifice. "She's in remission now," Sophia continued, her eyes finding Vincent's across the room. "Thanks to treatments we could barely afford, funded by jobs that people like you consider beneath notice. So yes, Mr. Reed, talent like mine does disappear into service work when love demands it." Harrison's face flushed deeper, this time with embarrassment rather than wine. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their evening's entertainment had come at a cost they'd never considered. But Vincent felt something else entirely, a recognition that pierced through his carefully constructed worldview like an arrow finding its mark. This young woman had sacrificed everything for someone she loved, had chosen duty over dreams with a grace he wasn't sure he possessed, and he had tried to humiliate her for it. He began, then stopped, realizing that any words he might offer would sound hollow against the weight of what she'd revealed. Sophia turned back toward the kitchen, but Mrs. Phillips' voice stopped her. "My dear," the older woman said softly, "forgive an old woman's curiosity, but do you still play? Outside of work, I mean." The question was gentler than Harrison's probing, but it cut just as deep. Sophia thought of the old, upright piano in her mother's apartment, its keys yellowed and several notes sticking, the instrument they'd bought for $20 from a church sale, because even that had required 3 months of saving. "Sometimes," she said, "when there's time." "And your mother? How is she now?" "Stronger every day," Sophia replied, and for the first time that evening her smile was genuine. "She still asks me to play for her, says it helps with the pain." Vincent watched this exchange with growing unease, seeing how easily the other guests had shifted from treating Sophia as entertainment to treating her as a person worthy of concern. Their compassion highlighted his own failure, made his earlier behavior seem even more inexcusable. But before he could find words to address what had happened, the hotel's catering manager appeared at his elbow, her face tight with professional anxiety. "Mr. Wallace," she whispered urgently, "we need Sophia back in the kitchen. We're behind schedule with the main course service." The intrusion shattered the moment's strange intimacy. Sophia nodded to the manager, then turned back to the assembled guests with a slight curtsy that managed to be both respectful and subtly ironic. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." She moved toward the kitchen with her characteristic grace, but Vincent found himself stepping into her path. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, driven by an urgency he didn't fully understand. "Ms. Martinez," she supplied quietly. "Sophia Martinez. Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology. What I did tonight was—" He paused, searching for words adequate to his shame. "Inexcusable." Sophia studied his face, seeing something there she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse rather than social obligation, but she'd learned not to trust the quick apologies of wealthy men when their behavior was witnessed by their peers. "Apology accepted, Mr. Wallace," she said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I really do need to get back to work." She stepped around him and disappeared through the kitchen doors, leaving Vincent standing alone in the center of his own gala, surrounded by guests whose eyes held questions he wasn't ready to answer. What would you do if you discovered that the person you'd tried to humiliate possessed more grace, talent, and strength than you'd ever dreamed possible? Sometimes our cruelest moments reveal not the weakness of others, but the poverty of our own hearts. As the evening resumed its programmed flow, dinner served, speeches given, checks written for charity, Vincent found himself watching the kitchen doors, waiting for glimpses of the woman who'd turned his world upside down with nothing more than music and truth. He'd thrown a stone at what he'd thought was glass, only to discover he'd struck diamond instead. And now, as the crowd around him resumed their comfortable conversations about market trends and vacation homes, Vincent Wallace realized he was facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could let this moment pass, file it away as an unfortunate but ultimately meaningless encounter, or he could find the courage to discover what happened when someone with everything to lose tried to make amends to someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. The question was whether a man who'd spent 60 years protecting his own comfort was brave enough to risk it for the chance to become someone worthy of the grace he'd witnessed tonight. Vincent Wallace stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Lincoln Park mansion 3 days later, watching Lake Michigan stretch endlessly toward a horizon painted in shades of doubt. The charity gala had raised over $2 million for children's cancer research, making it the most successful event in the foundation's history. Every society columnist in Chicago had praised his philanthropic leadership, and his assistant's phone had been ringing non-stop with congratulations from the city's elite. But all Vincent could think about was the 30 seconds of silence that had followed Sophia Martinez's performance, the moment when his entire worldview had cracked like ice under pressure. He'd barely slept since Saturday night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that music again, saw the dignity in Sophia's posture as she'd faced down a room full of people who'd tried to diminish her. Worse, he kept remembering his wife Margaret's voice from a conversation years ago. "Vincent, the measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals. It's how he treats people who can't do anything for him." The irony was devastating. He'd spent 2 years funding cancer research in Margaret's memory, believing he was honoring her values, while completely missing the lesson she'd tried to teach him about basic human decency. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Rebecca, away at Northwestern. "Dad saw the Tribune article about your gala. Mum would have loved the music. When can I meet this pianist everyone's talking about?" Vincent stared at the message, his throat tight. Rebecca didn't know about his role in humiliating Sophia. The society reporters had focused on the extraordinary performance, not the circumstances that had led to it. But he knew that if his daughter learned the truth, the disappointment in her eyes would destroy him. He'd tried to put the entire incident behind him, to return to the comfortable rhythms of board meetings and business dinners. But Tuesday morning had brought news that changed everything. His assistant Patricia had called with information he'd requested against his better judgment. Sophia Martinez worked 3 jobs, lived in a Pilsen apartment with her mother, and had indeed been a scholarship student at the Chicago Conservatory before withdrawing in her junior year. More troubling still, Patricia's research had uncovered something Vincent wished he didn't know. Sophia's mother, Carmen Martinez, was one of the beneficiaries of the very cancer research foundation his gala had supported. The woman whose daughter he'd tried to humiliate owed her life to his charity. Now, standing in his empty mansion surrounded by all the trappings of success, Vincent faced a choice that would define not just his relationship with Sophia Martinez, but his relationship with himself. He could pretend the encounter had never happened, file it away as an unfortunate but ultimately meaningless moment. Or he could find the courage to discover what redemption might look like when practiced by someone who'd spent 60 years avoiding accountability. His reflection in the window showed a man who looked older than his years, silver hair perfectly styled, but eyes carrying the weight of recognition. Margaret Steinway sat silent in the corner of his living room, its ebony surface reflecting the late afternoon light. He hadn't touched the keys since her funeral, couldn't bear to hear music in a house that felt like a mausoleum. But now, for the first time in 2 years, he found himself approaching the piano. His fingers found the keys tentatively, picking out the simple melody Margaret had taught him during their early marriage. Claire de Lune played haltingly by hands better suited to signing contracts than creating beauty. The contrast with what he'd witnessed Saturday night was devastating. Sophia's performance had been art elevated to the level of prayer, while his clumsy attempts were barely music at all. Yet Margaret had always listened to his playing with the same attention she gave to concert pianists, because she understood something he was only beginning to grasp. The value of music wasn't in its technical perfection, but in the heart that created it. Vincent's phone rang, shattering his reverie. Patricia's voice was carefully professional, but he caught the underlying tension. "Mr. Wallace, I have the information you requested about Ms. Martinez's current employment. She works breakfast shifts at Lou Mitchell's on Jackson, afternoon events at the Palmer House, and weekend catering through artisan events. However," she paused, and Vincent heard papers shuffling. "I'm afraid there's been a development." "What kind of development?" "She's been terminated from her position at the Palmer House, effective immediately." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. Terminated? On what grounds? The official reason cited is disruption of hotel operations and guest services. But Patricia's pause was loaded with meaning. Mr. Wallace, hotel management received several complaints following Saturday's event. Some guests felt that allowing staff to perform was inappropriate and unprofessional. Vincent felt sick. The very people who'd applauded Sophia's artistry had then complained about her presumption in displaying it. And the hotel, more concerned with avoiding controversy than protecting exceptional employees, had simply eliminated the problem. Who complained? His voice came out harder than he'd intended. I'd rather not say, sir, but the decision came from very high up in the hotel's management structure. Vincent understood immediately. Harrison Reed sat on the Palmer House's board of directors, and his embarrassment at being shown up by a waitress would have festered over the weekend. A few phone calls from the right people could end anyone's career in Chicago's hospitality industry. Thank you, Patricia. That will be all. Vincent hung up and stared at his reflection in the darkening window. Sophia Martinez, who'd sacrificed her dreams to save her mother's life, who'd faced down a room full of predators with nothing but talent and dignity, who'd shown him grace he didn't deserve, had lost her job because of his casual cruelty. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a lead cloak. For the first time in decades, Vincent Wallace found himself in a position where his money and influence might not be enough to fix what he'd broken. Even if he could get Sophia's job back, the damage went deeper than employment. He'd reduced a brilliant artist to a source of entertainment, and in doing so had given others permission to treat her as disposable. But as he sat in his empty mansion, surrounded by all the things money could buy, Vincent realized he had a choice. He could let guilt paralyze him, or he could find the courage to face the woman he'd wronged and discover what accountability looked like when practiced by someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding it. His phone was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to act. The number Patricia had provided rang 3 times before a voice answered, warm, slightly tired, speaking Spanish to someone in the background before switching to English. Hello? Miss Martinez? This is Vincent Wallace. The silence that followed was arctic. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Mr. Wallace, how did you get this number? I need to see you, to talk. There are things I need to say, and things I need to do to try to make this right. Make what right? But her tone suggested she already knew. You lost your job because of what I did Saturday night, because I turned you into a spectacle for my guests' amusement, because I was cruel in a way that gave others permission to be cruel to you. Another long pause, then, Mr. Wallace, with respect, if you're calling to assuage your conscience, I'm not interested in being your absolution. The words cut deep because they were true. That's not why I'm calling, or not only why. Ms. Martinez, I've spent 3 days trying to understand how someone could play the way you did while serving tables to survive. I've been researching your background, and I know about the conservatory, about your mother's illness, about the choice you made. You've been researching me. Her voice carried an edge of anger now. You humiliate me in public, cost me my job, and now you invade my privacy? Yes, Vincent said simply, and I know how that sounds. But I also know that your mother is alive because of treatments funded by the same foundation my gala supports. I know you withdrew from the conservatory in your junior year, 3 credits shy of graduation. And I know that talent like yours doesn't just disappear, it goes underground, waiting for someone to recognize its worth. What do you want, Mr. Wallace? The question hung between them, loaded with the weight of Saturday night's humiliation and 3 days of sleepless guilt. Vincent looked around his empty mansion, at the piano that had been silent for 2 years, at the life he'd built on the assumption that money could purchase meaning. I want to offer you something, he said finally. Not charity, not guilt money. An opportunity to finish what you started at the conservatory, to pursue the career you set aside, to let your talent reach the stages it was meant for. In exchange for what? Your public redemption? A feel-good story for the society pages? Vincent winced at the accuracy of her suspicion. In exchange for letting me learn what it means to use privilege responsibly, for showing me how to honor my wife's memory by actually living the values she tried to teach me. The silence stretched so long that Vincent wondered if she'd hung up. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less guarded. "Mr. Wallace, I appreciate whatever guilt is driving this call, but I can't afford your charity. I have responsibilities, obligations that don't disappear because you're feeling bad about your behavior." "I know," Vincent said, "and I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking you to let me help you find a way to honor them, while also honoring the gift you've been given. Your mother needs you, yes, but the world needs your music. And maybe, if you let me, I can find a way to serve both needs." As the words hung in the air between them, Vincent realized he was offering something he'd never offered anyone before, not just money or opportunity, but the chance to change him as much as he might change her circumstances. For the first time in his life, he was asking someone to save him rather than the other way around. The question now was whether Sophia Martinez possessed not just the grace to forgive him, but the courage to trust him with the dreams she'd buried 3 years ago. 2 months later, Sophia stood at the edge of the Chicago Conservatory's main performance hall, her hands trembling as she adjusted the simple black dress Vincent had insisted was perfect for her audition. Through the heavy oak doors, she could hear the faint sound of scales being practiced, the warm-up exercises that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The past 8 weeks had felt like living in someone else's dream. Vincent's offer hadn't been charity. It had been a partnership more complex and meaningful than either of them had anticipated. He'd arranged for her to complete her final credits through independent study while working as a part-time cultural consultant for his foundation. More importantly, he'd connected her mother, Carmen, with a clinical trial for a new maintenance therapy, fully funded and promising better outcomes than anything they'd dared hope for. But the real transformation had happened in Vincent's Lincoln Park mansion, where twice a week Sophia had come to practice on Margaret Steinway and to teach Vincent what music meant when it came from the heart rather than the ego. "You ready?" Vincent's voice came from behind her, gentle with the careful respect that had replaced his earlier commanding tone. Sophia turned to find him approaching with Carmen, her mother's face bright with excitement, despite the fatigue that still marked her features. At 52, Carmen Martinez had the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving cancer and raising a daughter who'd inherited both her resilience and her dreams. "Mija," Carmen said, taking Sophia's hands in hers, "your father would be so proud. All those years he played guitar on the weekends, dreaming of stages like this." Sophia's throat tightened at the mention of her father, gone 10 years now but never forgotten. "He's the one who taught me that music isn't about perfection, it's about truth." Vincent watched this exchange with something approaching awe. Over the past 2 months, he'd witnessed the deep love between mother and daughter, seen how Sophia's sacrifice had been motivated not by martyrdom, but by joy. The joy of keeping the person she loved most in the world alive and fighting. "The committee is ready for you," he said quietly. "Professor Williams is in there, along with the dean and 2 guest evaluators from Juilliard." Sophia's eyes widened. "Juilliard?" Vincent's smile was soft, proud. Professor Williams may have mentioned to his colleagues that his most promising student was finally returning to finish what she started. Word travels quickly in the classical music world. Carmen squeezed her daughter's hands. "Remember what I told you when you were little? Music isn't something you do, it's something you are. So go in there and be yourself." Sophia nodded, drawing strength from her mother's words and from the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The past 2 months had been difficult in ways she hadn't expected, not because of the work, but because of the vulnerability required to let Vincent Wallace see her real dreams, her real fears, her real self. Their first meeting after his phone call had been tense, filled with careful negotiations about terms and boundaries. But slowly, as they'd worked together on foundation events and she'd played for him in his empty mansion, something unexpected had emerged. Genuine friendship based on mutual recognition of each other's wounds and gifts. Vincent had lost his wife and daughter's respect through emotional isolation. Sophia had lost her dreams through necessary sacrifice. Both had learned that talent without purpose was meaningless, that privilege without responsibility was empty. that healing required the courage to let someone else witness your broken places. "Ms. Martinez," a student assistant appeared at the door. "The committee is ready for your audition." This was it, the moment that would determine whether the past 3 years had been a detour or a dead end. Sophia had chosen to audition with the same piece she'd played at Vincent's gala, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but this time she would play it as it was meant to be heard, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of hope. She walked into the performance hall with her head high, seeing Professor Williams' encouraging nod, the interested expressions of the evaluators, the way Vincent and Carmen slipped quietly into seats in the back row. The Steinway grand piano waited under bright stage lights, its presence both familiar and intimidating. Sophia took her place at the bench and closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself the way she'd learned during those quiet evenings in Vincent's living room. When she opened them again, she was ready. The first movement began like a conversation with her younger self, the student who'd thought talent was enough, who'd believed dreams came true through hard work and hope alone. But as the music developed, it incorporated everything she'd learned since. That love sometimes required sacrifice, that strength could be found in service, that the most beautiful music came from understanding both joy and loss. She played the piece she'd rehearsed 1,000 times, but also the piece she'd lived, every note informed by 3 years of growth, struggle, and the kind of wisdom that could only be earned through suffering, transformed into purpose. The second movement carried the weight of her mother's diagnosis, the fear and desperation, and ultimate decision to choose love over ambition. But it also carried the unexpected gifts that choice had brought. Resilience she'd never known she possessed, connections with people whose struggles mirrored her own, the discovery that talent shared was talent multiplied. As she moved into the final movement, Sophia felt the presence of everyone who'd shaped her journey, her father's gentle encouragement, her mother's fierce love, Professor Williams's patient teaching, and yes, even Vincent's accidental gift of showing her that grace could transform even the cruelest moments into something meaningful. When the last note faded into silence, the auditorium was completely still. Then Professor Williams began to clap, his face bright with tears he didn't try to hide. The other evaluators joined him, and finally the small audience Vincent and Carmen comprised, their applause carrying 3 years of hopes and dreams and second chances. As Sophia rose from the piano bench, she saw Vincent wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, his usually composed demeanor completely abandoned. Beside him, Carmen was sobbing with pride and relief, her hands pressed to her heart. The lead evaluator, a distinguished woman from Juilliard, approached the stage. "Ms. Martinez," she said, "that was extraordinary, not just technically, though your skill is undeniable, but emotionally. You've taken classical repertoire and made it completely your own." Professor Williams joined them on stage, his smile brilliant. "Sophia, I'd like you to meet Dr. Catherine Morrison from Juilliard and Dr. James Foster from the Curtis Institute. They've both expressed interest in discussing graduate programs with you." The words seemed to echo from very far away. Graduate school, professional training. The career she'd thought was lost forever was being offered back to her, not as charity or consolation prize, but as recognition of what she'd become through struggle. "There's one more thing," Vincent said, approaching the stage with an expression Sophia couldn't quite read. "Professor Williams and I have been discussing a proposal. The Foundation is establishing a scholarship program for students who've had to interrupt their studies due to family circumstances. We'd like you to be our first recipient, but also our program director." Sophia stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "You want me to help other students who've had to make the same choice I did. I want you to show them that interrupted dreams aren't the same as abandoned dreams," Vincent replied. "That talent can survive anything if it's supported by community and love." Carmen had made her way to the stage now, her arms wrapping around her daughter in a hug that felt like coming home. "Mija," she whispered, "you saved my life by giving up yours. Now it's time to save your life by living it." As the small group gathered around the piano, student and teachers, mentor and friend, mother and daughter, Sophia felt the deep satisfaction of a circle completing itself. 3 years ago, she'd walked away from this world to save someone she loved. Today she was walking back into it not just as an individual pursuing personal dreams, but as someone who understood that the greatest music came from connection, sacrifice, and the courage to let others witness your authentic self. Vincent approached her as the others discussed program details and scholarship logistics. "Ms. Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I said that night at the gala." "Vincent," she replied, "they'd moved to first names weeks ago. You've done more than apologize. You've shown me that people can change, that mistakes can become bridges instead of barriers. You taught me something more important," he said. "You taught me that privilege isn't about what you can take, it's about what you can give, and that the most valuable gift isn't money or opportunity, but the chance to witness someone else's greatness and help it flourish." 6 months later, Sophia performed her graduate recital at the Chicago Conservatory to a packed house that included scholarship recipients from the Martinez Wallace Foundation, her mother in the front row, and Vincent Wallace in his usual seat 3 rows back, close enough to witness the magic, far enough away to let it belong entirely to her. As the final notes of her program echoed through the hall, Sophia thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A night that had begun with humiliation had become the catalyst for transformation, not just her own, but Vincent's, and through their foundation, dozens of other students whose dreams had been interrupted but not destroyed. Do you believe that our worst moments can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs? Sometimes, the people who wound us deepest are the ones who teach us most about our own strength. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they learn something about strength from us in return. After the recital, as friends and family gathered to celebrate, Sophia found a quiet moment at the piano. She played a simple melody, Clair de Lune, the piece Vincent had been struggling with when they first began working together. But she played it the way he'd finally learned to, not perfectly, but with heart, with intention, with the understanding that music's greatest power lay not in its technical brilliance, but in its ability to connect one human soul to another. In the audience, Vincent listened with tears in his eyes, knowing that the broken man who'd tried to humiliate a waitress 2 years ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or power, but in the lives you helped flourish and the dreams you helped come true. The music filled the hall like a prayer, like a promise, like the sound of 2 broken people who'd found wholeness, not in spite of their wounds, but because of their willingness to let those wounds become bridges towards something beautiful, lasting, and true. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one, and don't forget to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.